It's 3:22 in the morning on a Tuesday, and I'm sitting in my truck in the parking garage of a building I spent 19 years keeping alive. The engine's off, the heater's not running. I've got a gas station coffee going cold in the cuff holder, and a badge that technically stopped working at 5 p.m. yesterday, sitting on the passenger seat. I'm not here because I forgot something. I'm here because my phone has been ringing since midnight, and I needed to sit in the dark for a while before I decided whether to answer it. Let me back up. My name is Owen Mackay. I'm 51 years old. I grew up in Akron, Ohio, learned to fix things because my father believed that a man who couldn't repair what he owned didn't really own anything. I went to Ohio State on a partial scholarship, got a degree in electrical engineering, and spent the first 6 years of my career at a regional utility company in Columbus, learning the difference between what the manual says and what actually works. I joined Meridian Biologistics in 2006. They were a mid-sized pharmaceutical cold chain company. They moved temperature-sensitive medications from manufacturers to hospitals, pharmacies, and specialty clinics across the eastern seaboard. At the time, they had about 40 refrigerated distribution centers, 300 and some employees, and a monitoring system that was, to put it generously, a digital disaster. I was hired to fix it. What it meant exactly took me about 8 months to fully understand. The system that managed temperature monitoring, compliance logging, route optimization, and regulatory reporting for every one of their facilities had been built in pieces by 4 different contractors over 12 years, none of whom had ever spoken to each other. It was like someone had tried to build a house by having the electrician, the plumber, the framer, and the roofer each work in total isolation and then shoved everything together and called it done. Nothing talked to the right things. Alerts fired at random. Compliance reports required someone, usually me, to manually reconcile 3 different data sources every single time. The FDA had flagged them twice in 3 years for documentation inconsistencies, and their insurance carrier had started asking uncomfortable questions. So I got to work. I didn't just patch it. I rebuilt it, not all at once. You can't take down a pharmaceutical cold chain operation all at once. People's medication is on those trucks. But, methodically, over 3 years, I replaced every broken connection, every colludged workaround, every system that existed only because someone in 2003 thought it was a good idea. I wrote about 60,000 lines of integration code. I documented every piece of it. I trained the operations team. I built in redundancy, fail-safes, automatic escalation protocols. When I was done, Meridian passed their next FDA audit with 0 findings for the first time in a decade. My boss at the time, a guy named Len, who'd been running operations since before I got there, shook my hand in the parking lot afterward and said, "Owen, you just saved this company." He meant it literally. One more finding, and they were looking at a consent decree that would have cost them their operating license in 3 states. So that's who I was at Meridian. I was the guy who kept the lights on. Literally and figuratively. I knew every system, every quirk, everything that would break at 2 a.m. if the temperature at the Newark facility dipped 2 degrees below threshold and the backup alert didn't fire correctly. I knew it because I'd been woken up by it. Multiple times. Over 19 years, I watched the company grow. 40 distribution centers became 97. 300 employees became over 1,200. We expanded into the Midwest, then the South, then started handling some West Coast contracts. My team grew from just me to 8 engineers and a dedicated QA specialist. I also watched the leadership change. Len retired in 2018. His replacement was a woman named Sandra. Sandra had come up through finance, understood margins, understood growth, understood investors. She was good at her job in the ways that mattered to the board. She was not particularly good at understanding what held the operation together. She once asked me why we couldn't just switch to a SaaS platform for the monitoring system. I spent 40 minutes explaining why, specifically, the regulatory requirements for pharmaceutical cold chain documentation made that a more complicated question than she was assuming. She thanked me politely, and I never heard about it again. Sandra left in 2022 to take a CFO position at a larger company. The board went looking for someone who could, in their words, modernize the culture and accelerate the growth trajectory. They found her in Boston. Her name was Renee Gallagher. She was 38 years old. She had an MBA from Tuck and had spent the previous 4 years as a VP at a healthcare technology startup, that had burned through $200 million in venture capital before pivoting twice and eventually being acqui-hired for parts. Before that, she had been a management consultant. She had never worked in logistics. She had never worked in pharmaceutical supply chain. She had never, as far as I could tell, worked anywhere that involved actual physical things moving through actual physical space under regulatory oversight. She also wore Allbirds to her first all-hands meeting and opened with a slide that said, "Culture eats strategy for breakfast" in 72-point font. I want to be fair to her. She was smart. She was confident. She had energy. She could read a room, and she could give a presentation, and she clearly believed completely in what she was saying. I just wasn't always sure that what she was saying had any relationship to the actual problem in front of us. The first 6 months weren't bad. She spent a lot of time listening, or appearing to listen, meeting with department heads, doing facility walkthroughs, talking to drivers and warehouse managers. She had a genuine curiosity about the operation that I respected. We had a few good conversations about the monitoring system, about regulatory risk, about what I called the invisible infrastructure, all the stuff that didn't show up on a dashboard but kept the whole thing running. She nodded a lot when I talked. I thought she was taking it in. Then she hired a chief transformation officer. His name was Kyle Drummond. He was 34. He had a background in organizational agility. I had to look that up, and had previously led transformation initiatives at a regional bank and a mid-size retail chain. He arrived with a mandate to identify legacy constraints and architect a modern operational framework, which I eventually understood to mean find old things and replace them with new things, whether or not the old things were working. Kyle had an unlimited appetite for software demonstrations. Every other week, there was a new vendor in the conference room with a slide deck promising to revolutionize something: AI-powered route optimization, predictive maintenance platforms, digital twin environments, real-time compliance dashboards. I sat in most of those meetings. I asked questions. Some of the questions were pointed. After one meeting, Carl pulled me aside in the hallway and said, in a tone that was friendly but wasn't, "Owen, I want to make sure we're approaching these conversations with an open mind." I told him I was. I told him my mind was open to solutions that would actually pass an FDA audit, withstand a Class 2 recall scenario, and not create a single point of failure in our temperature excursion reporting chain. He smiled and said we'd continue the dialogue. I knew what that meant. 6 months later, Kyle unveiled Project Meridian Forward. It was a phased technology transformation plan. New cloud-based monitoring system, new route optimization AI, new compliance reporting platform, all from different vendors, all to be implemented over 18 months. The total price tag was just under $4 million. My written assessment of the plan was 11 pages long. The short version was, the timeline was unrealistic. The integration plan hadn't accounted for our FDA documentation requirements. The new monitoring vendor had no pharmaceutical cold chain experience, and the transition period would create exactly the kind of compliance exposure that had nearly cost us our license in 2005. I included specific regulatory citations. I included a risk matrix. I included 3 alternative approaches that could achieve the modernization goals without the exposure. My assessment was received with what I can only describe as polite burial. It was acknowledged. It was appreciated. It was never discussed again. Kyle's plan was approved by the board in March. I kept doing my job. Here's the thing about infrastructure work that people who haven't done it don't understand. The better you do it, the more invisible you become. When the system works perfectly, when no alerts fire at 2 a.m., when every audit passes, when every compliance report generates cleanly and automatically, no one thinks about it. No one thinks about it. The system just works, and people assume it will keep working. The way people assume the lights will come on when they flip the switch. They stop thinking about why. The incident that ended my career at Meridian was small. Almost absurdly small. It was a Thursday afternoon in late October. Someone in my LinkedIn network, a former colleague from the utility days, shared a post. The post was from an industrial safety consultant, and it said something like, 19 years in the field taught me that institutional knowledge isn't a legacy problem, it's a risk management asset. The people who understand why the thing works are the people who know how to keep it working. I liked it. That was it. I tapped the thumbs up icon on my phone while I was eating lunch. The following Monday morning, my calendar showed a meeting at 2 p.m. The subject line was Alignment Conversation. The attendees were Renee, Kyle, and someone from HR I'd met once at an onboarding event. I knew what that meant too. The meeting lasted 22 minutes. Kyle did most of the talking. The words he used were cultural alignment, organizational evolution, and forward momentum. What he meant was that my public endorsement, his word, of content that characterized operational experience as superior to new thinking was inconsistent with Meridian's transformation priorities. I asked him to say that again. He did. Essentially, I had liked a LinkedIn post that implicitly criticized the approach he had championed, and that was being treated as a political statement. Renee was very calm. She said she valued my contributions. She said the company needed to move forward. She said she hoped I understood. I understood. They had my final paycheck ready. They had a severance agreement, 19 years, and I was out of the building by 4 p.m. with a banker's box and a coffee mug that said, "Keep calm and check the logs." I sat in my truck in the parking garage for a while that day too. Then I drove home and told my wife. She listened. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "Did you sign the severance?" I said yes. She said, "Okay, what do you need right now?" I said I needed about 48 hours to just be angry. She said, "Take the week. I love that woman." Here's what I didn't tell Renee or Kyle or the HR person. The new monitoring system wasn't live yet. Project Meridian Forward was 6 months into an 18-month rollout. The old system, my system, was still running. But Kyle's team had spent the last 4 months peeling back layers of it, migrating pieces of it, disabling redundancies they didn't understand and didn't bother to ask about, all in preparation for the new platform. They had done this without documentation review, without testing protocols, without asking me. I had submitted 3 written memos over those 4 months flagging specific risks. I had email threads, I had timestamps, I had been ignored with great consistency. So when I drove home that Monday, I knew something that Kyle didn't know, and Renee didn't know, and the board didn't know. The system they were running was not the system I had built. It was a partially disassembled version of the system I had built, with pieces missing and connections rerouted. And there was a specific set of conditions, a combination of temperature excursion alerts firing simultaneously across multiple facilities during a high-volume period that would cause the compliance logging chain to fail silently. No crash, no obvious error, just a gap in the documentation record that would be invisible until someone looked for it. Usually, I was the one who looked. I spent Tuesday at home. I mowed the lawn. I took a long walk. I ate dinner with my wife and we talked about what came next, about maybe taking a few weeks before I started looking, about a fishing trip we'd been putting off for 3 years. I slept better than I had in months. Wednesday morning, my phone rang at 6:47 a.m. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. The voicemail was Kyle. His voice had a quality I'd never heard from him before. Something thin and carefully controlled. The voice of a man working hard not to sound like he was panicking. He said there had been a technical situation overnight, and he was hoping I might be willing to have a conversation at my earliest convenience. I went and made coffee. At 8:15, my phone rang again. This time it was Renee. I let that one go to voicemail too. Her message was shorter. She said, "Owen, I know we left things in a difficult place. I'm asking you to call me back, please." I sat with my coffee and thought about Len, who'd shaken my hand in the parking lot after the audit. I thought about the 1,200 people who worked at Meridian, most of whom had no idea what had just happened or what was about to happen. I thought about the hospitals and the pharmacies and the specialty clinics waiting on medication that was currently sitting in refrigerated trucks whose temperature compliance logging had developed a quiet, invisible gap in the record chain. I called my wife into the kitchen. I played her both voicemails. She listened. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "I want to help fix it," I said, "but not for free." She nodded slowly. "Then don't." I called Renee back at 9 a.m. She answered on the first ring. I didn't let her open with anything. I said, "Renee, before we talk about what's happening with the system, we need to talk about terms. Because I'm not employed by Meridian anymore, and whatever I do for you from this point forward is going to be governed by a consulting agreement." There was a pause. Then she said, "Of course." Absolutely. What are you thinking? I told her what I was thinking. I had spent part of Tuesday night, after my wife had gone to sleep, writing down what I thought was fair. Daily consulting rate. I named a number that was considerably more than my daily salary equivalent had been. A 3-month minimum engagement. Reinstatement of my health benefits effective immediately through the duration of the engagement. A written acknowledgement that my November severance agreement did not preclude consulting work for Meridian. And one more thing. The memos I submitted between June and October, I said. The 3 written assessments flagging transition risks. I want written acknowledgement that those were received, reviewed, and not acted upon. I want that in the record. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then I can have legal draw something up. Good, I said. Send it to my personal email by noon. If the terms are acceptable, I can be on site by 1 o'clock. She said she'd make it happen. I went upstairs and told my wife I was going back in. She handed me my thermos. Wear something comfortable, she said. I put on jeans, a flannel shirt, and my old work boots. I've had those boots since 2009. The left one has a scrape across the toe from the time I dropped a server rack in the Portland facility. I like them. They remind me that I have done real things in real places, and the marks are still there. I got to Meridian at 1:15. Kyle met me in the lobby. He looked like he hadn't slept. He was in a dress shirt, with no jacket, top button open, the specific dishevelment of someone whose careful exterior had encountered something it couldn't manage. He started to say something about being glad I came. I said, "Take me to the server room." The situation was what I'd expected, mostly. The silent failure in the compliance logging chain had been triggered at 11:47 p.m. the previous night when 3 facilities, Newark, Richmond, and Charlotte, had simultaneous temperature excursion events during a shift change. The new monitoring vendor's system had captured the alerts correctly. What it hadn't done was hand them off correctly to the compliance documentation chain because the integration bridge that was supposed to handle that handoff was a piece of my old code that Kyle's team had partially deprecated in September without fully replacing. The result was that for approximately 6.5 hours, Meridian had temperature excursion events in 3 facilities with no compliant documentation trail. In pharmaceutical cold chain terms, that is a serious problem. In FDA terms, it is the kind of problem that generates warning letters and sometimes consent decrees. It also meant that the medication in question, insulin mostly, and a specialty biologic, had a chain of custody gap that would need to be resolved before any of it could be distributed. Sitting in that server room, looking at the gap in the logs, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not satisfaction, not vindication exactly, something quieter. The specific, tired recognition of a person who had tried to prevent something, been ignored, and was now watching the thing happen. I got to work. The first thing I did was stabilize the bridge. Not fully rebuild it, just patch it to stop the bleeding and restore the documentation chain for active events going forward. That took about 2 hours. Then I started the forensic reconstruction of the 6.5-hour gap, pulling data from every backup source, every secondary log, every redundant capture point that Kyle's team hadn't disabled yet. The reconstructed record wouldn't be perfect. There would need to be an incident report, but it would be defensible. It would show the data existed, was captured, and was recoverable. Around 4 p.m., Renee came into the server room. She stood near the door for a moment, watching me work. "How bad is it?" she asked. I turned around in my chair. "You're going to need to self-report to the FDA. That's not optional, and the sooner you do it, the better. You'll need an incident report that accurately describes the root cause, which is going to mean documenting the decisions that led to the bridge deprecation. The data is recoverable enough that this probably doesn't rise to warning letter level if you handle it correctly and quickly." She nodded slowly. "The medication?" she asked. "The insulin is probably fine, excursions well within acceptable parameters based on the sensor data I can see. The biologic is going to need a more careful look. Your medical affairs team needs to be involved today, not tomorrow." She was quiet for a moment. "What would you have done differently?" I thought about that. "I would have read the memos," I said. She didn't answer. She just nodded and left. I worked until almost 9 p.m. By the time I left, The compliance chain was stable, the incident documentation was drafted, the medical affairs team had been briefed, and the self-report to the FDA was scheduled for the following morning. It wasn't pretty, but it was honest, and it was defensible, and nobody's medication was going to harm anyone. I went back to my truck. I sat there for a few minutes in the dark of the parking garage. Then I drove home. My wife was up. She'd saved dinner. She sat across from me at the kitchen table while I ate, and I told her the whole thing, start to finish. The gap in the logs, the 6.5 hours, the insulin, the biologic, the self-report. When I was done, she said, "Do you feel better?" I thought about it. "I feel like I did my job," I said. She reached across the table and put her hand on mine. "That's the same thing." The consulting engagement lasted 4 months. I rebuilt the integration layer properly, this time with full documentation and a transition protocol that the new vendors team actually followed. I ran 2 FDA audit simulations before the real one. The real audit in February had 2 minor findings, process documentation issues unrelated to the system, and 0 findings related to the October incident. Kyle was gone by December. I don't know exactly what happened. I just know that 1 week he was there, and the next week his name was gone from the org chart. Renee stayed. She called me the day after the February audit and said, "Genuinely, thank you, Owen." I believed her. At the end of the engagement, they offered me a permanent position, consulting director, my own team, different title, but essentially the same work. I thought about it for a week. I turned it down. I had spent 19 years being the person who kept the lights on in a building where nobody thought about why the lights stayed on. I was good at it. I was proud of it, but I was also 51 years old, and I had a fishing trip I'd been putting off for 3 years, and there were other companies with systems that didn't work and people who needed someone to come in and make them work. I went fishing with my wife in June. 3 weeks in Montana. I caught a brown trout that was, my wife will tell you, of only moderate size, but I thought it was magnificent. I have 3 clients now. None of them are as complicated as Meridian. One of them is a regional food distributor in Tennessee who found out when I arrived that their cold chain monitoring had 4 separate single points of failure that nobody had documented because the person who knew about them had retired in 2021 and nobody had asked him the right questions before he left. I asked them the right questions. The thing nobody tells you about being the person who understands how something actually works. Not in theory, not from a consultant slide deck, but in the way that comes from having been there at 2 a.m. when it broke, is that it is genuinely valuable. Not in the way that gets you promoted, not in the way that gets you a corner office or a seat at the strategy table, but in the way that matters when it matters most. Systems don't care about transformation roadmaps. They don't care about cultural alignment or forward momentum or organizational agility. They do the thing they were built to do, or they fail to do it, and the difference almost always lives in a detail that someone who was paying attention noticed a long time ago and wrote down somewhere. Write it down. And read the memos. I've had a lot of time to think about what actually happened at Meridian. Not the technical part. I understood that the night it broke, but the part underneath it, the part about how things go wrong long before anyone notices they're going wrong. What I keep coming back to is this. Renee didn't fire me because I was bad at my job. She fired me because I was good at it in a way that made her uncomfortable. My competence was a reminder that there were things she didn't understand. And rather than sit with that discomfort long enough to learn something, it was easier to label me. Old guard. Legacy thinking. Not aligned. Those words are just a clean way of saying, you make me feel like I don't know what I'm doing, and I'd rather you be gone than feel that way. That's a human thing, not an unusual thing. I've seen it before. The difference at Meridian was the stakes. There were 1,200 people's livelihoods sitting on top of that system, and medications sitting in trucks, and patients on the other end of those trucks who needed what was inside them. The consequences of that particular pride weren't abstract. Carl was a different story. I don't think Kyle was malicious. I think Kyle genuinely believed that newer was better, that transformation was inherently progress, that the friction I represented was the problem rather than a signal worth listening to. That kind of certainty, The certainty that comes from never having been wrong in a way that cost you something real is its own kind of danger. He had never been at the other end of a 2 a.m. call when something broke. He had never had to sit in a server room and figure out why the logs stopped talking to each other. So he didn't know what he didn't know, and he didn't know enough to ask. That's what the 3 memos were about, really. Not just the technical risks. They were me saying, there is something here you need to understand before you touch it. The fact that those memos were received, acknowledged, and ignored is where the whole thing started. Everything else, the October incident, the FDA self-report, the 6.5-hour gap in the documentation chain, was just the consequence arriving on schedule. I don't say that with any pleasure. I want to be clear about that. There was nothing satisfying about sitting in that server room at midnight, reconstructing logs, while insulin sat in trucks. The people I was trying to protect weren't Renee or Kyle. They were the warehouse manager in Newark, who'd worked there for 11 years and had no idea any of this was happening. They were the pharmacist waiting on a shipment. They were the patient who needed what was in that shipment. They were the patient who needed what was in that shipment. That's why I went back. Not to prove a point, not for the consulting rate, though I wasn't going to undercharge for it either, because the work mattered and I was the person who could do it, and walking away from it entirely would have meant letting people who had nothing to do with any of this pay the price for decisions they didn't make. What I learned, or maybe what I was reminded of, because I think I always knew it, is that integrity isn't the dramatic thing. It's not the moment you stand up and make the speech. It's the 11 pages you write when nobody wants to read them. It's the memos you send knowing they'll be ignored. It's going back into the building in your work boots and doing the thing that needs doing because the alternative is people getting hurt. And then it's knowing when to leave. I turned down the permanent position because I'd earned the right to. I'd spent 19 years being essential to a building that didn't know I was there. I didn't need to spend another 19 proving the same thing to the same people. Sometimes the most honest thing you can do is let your work speak for itself and then walk out the door. The fishing was good. The trout was magnificent. My wife took a picture.